A massive anaconda emerged from the shadows and wrapped itself around a lioness mother, right in front of her helpless cubs. It looked like the end, until an unexpected ally stepped out of the jungle. The midday sun filtered softly through the dense canopy of the African savanna, painting gold streaks across a quiet riverbank. Kessie, a lioness known for her strength and fierce devotion to her two cubs, had finally found a moment of peace. She knelt at the water's edge, her cubs giggling nearby, pawing at frogs and butterflies, unaware of the silent menace lurking beneath the still surface. Then the air shifted. The birds stopped singing. Even the insects fell quiet. Kessie's ears twitched. It wasn't the wind. It was that ancient primal silence, the kind that only ever meant one thing: death was near. Without warning, the water exploded. A monstrous anaconda, thicker than any Kessie had ever seen, surged from the shallows like a living nightmare. In an instant, its heavy coils wrapped around her torso, crushing her ribs with relentless pressure. A roar of agony tore through the clearing, while her cubs froze, wide-eyed, unable to move, unable to understand. She fought, claws slashing, teeth gnashing, but her strength was fading, fast. Just when the light in her eyes began to dim, something stirred beyond the trees. Not prey, not predator, something different. A silhouette emerged, powerful, unfamiliar, and walking toward the chaos with purpose. And in that surreal, impossible moment, the story of instinct, wild loyalty, and redemption began. The morning had started just like any other. The sun, not yet scorching, cast long shadows across the golden grasslands, and the breeze carried the earthy scent of dew and dust. Kessie moved with quiet grace, her paws sinking softly into the soil as she led her two cubs, Tambo and Lila, away from the pride's territory toward a secluded watering hole she'd discovered weeks earlier. It was her secret place, a pocket of serenity where tall reeds grew wild and birds flitted about without fear. Tambo bounced beside her, always the curious one, while Lila clung closer to her mother's side, cautious and watchful. Kessie, ever alert, scanned the horizon. Though the savannah was vast and open, she had learned long ago that danger didn't always announce itself. Some of the deadliest threats came from the quietest corners. They reached the clearing by mid-morning. The water shimmered under the sun, and the trees swayed gently as if inviting them in. Kessie crouched to drink, muscles relaxing for the first time in days. The cubs played nearby, tumbling in the grass, their soft growls and tiny roars echoing across the clearing. But just as Kessie lifted her head from the water, something felt off. The birds had stopped chirping. The wind held its breath. It wasn't a sound that alarmed her. It was the absence of sound, a hollow quiet, dense and unnatural. She froze, ears twitching, eyes narrowing as she searched the reeds across the bank. Nothing moved. Still, her instincts screamed. She slowly turned to gather her cubs when the surface of the water beside her erupted in a violent splash. She barely had time to snarl before a massive weight struck her side. The anaconda, a dark green blur of muscle and intent, launched from the shallows with terrifying speed. Its body, glistening and thick as a tree trunk, coiled around her. Midsection in seconds, the air left her lungs. She clawed at the scales, kicking wildly, trying to keep her cubs in sight. But they were no longer playing. They stood, frozen on the far side of the clearing, eyes locked with hers, wide, terrified, and helpless. And in that suspended moment, with the crushing weight of death wrapped around her, Kessie realized something chilling. She hadn't been the one hunting this morning. She had been the bait. Kessie had fought before, against rival lionesses, against hyenas that dared circle her pride, even against starvation itself during the worst droughts. But nothing in her memory prepared her for this. The anaconda was an entirely different force. It didn't growl or snap. It moved with cold precision, a living muscle designed to suffocate. Each breath became harder to draw. Her vision blurred. At the edges, she could feel her ribs tightening under the unrelenting pressure of the coils, her front legs pinned, her claws scraping air. The pain was sharp, but the fear was sharper. Across the clearing, Tambo let out a whimper, the sound cracking like glass in the eerie stillness. Lila crept backward, her small frame trembling. Their mother, the fierce protector, the one who wrestled down gazelles and growled lions into submission, now writhed helplessly, her power stripped in seconds. And all they could do was watch. The water rippled again, and for a brief moment, Kessie caught a glimpse of the creature's eyes. Cold, empty. There was no anger or pleasure in its attack, just instinct, survival. It didn't care that she had cubs. It didn't care that she had a life beyond that moment. The reeds rustled on the opposite bank, and Kessie thought foolishly that another predator had come to finish the job. But instead of claws or fangs, there was nothing. Just more silence. A dense, suffocating blanket of it. It was in that silence that something stirred in her. Not strength, not hope, but memory. She remembered her mother, once caught in a snare left by poachers, how she had fought for hours, teeth bloody, muscles trembling. Kessie had watched her die from the bushes, too young to help. And now, here she was, in a mirrored tragedy. She tightened. Every muscle arched her back and roared, not a sound of strength but of desperation. It shattered the silence. Birds burst from trees. A monkey screeched from afar. The entire jungle flinched, and in that exact moment, just beyond the brush, where no animal should have stood, something moved. The sound came first. A rustling of branches, too deliberate to be the wind, too heavy to be a bird. Kessie's ears, pressed flat against her skull, caught it even through the haze of her weakening senses. Something was approaching, but not with the low slink of a predator or the skittish dash of prey. This was slower, intentional. She didn't have time to wonder. With a sudden surge, the anaconda adjusted its grip, tightening around her chest, forcing out what little breath she had left. Her spine arched involuntarily, paws flailing in the dust. Her vision darkened around the edges. A high-pitched ringing filled her ears, drowning out the panicked cries of her cubs. Then, a flash. From the shadows behind the reeds, a massive weight collided with the anaconda's body. The sound was like a tree trunk snapping, raw and thunderous. The snake hissed, not in pain, but in surprise, as it was thrown off balance. Kessie dropped to the ground, air rushing painfully back into her lungs. She gasped, coughing, her legs twitching as she tried to crawl away, but she couldn't look away. There, standing over her, was a creature no lion would dare confront, a full-grown silverback gorilla. His chest heaved with slow, deliberate breaths. His eyes, dark and alert, stayed locked on the writhing anaconda as it uncoiled and began circling again, preparing to strike. Kessie blinked. This made no sense. Gorillas didn't intervene in hunts. They avoided predators. They protected. Their own stayed in the forest, followed their own rules. But this one had stepped in, crossed a line drawn deep into the instinctual fabric of the wild. The anaconda lunged again, this time aiming for the gorilla, but he sidestepped with shocking speed. He grabbed a thick branch and swung, slamming it across the snake's midsection. The force echoed through the clearing, and the snake recoiled, its body twisting in frustration and pain. From her place in the dirt, Kessie watched, stunned. Her cubs were huddled behind a tree now, trembling but alive, and in her heart, something even more unsettling stirred. Why would a gorilla risk everything for a lioness? Something about the way he moved, the way he watched her between attacks, felt familiar. Too familiar. The gorilla didn't roar, didn't scream, didn't make a show of dominance. He simply stood between Casey and the anaconda, muscles coiled like cables, breath measured, eyes calculating. The sun glinted off his broad shoulders, dust clinging to the fur around his arms. He didn't look afraid, only resolute. Casey lay partially curled on her side, ribs aching, unable to move without a jolt of searing pain. Her gaze flicked between the two giants, predator and protector, unsure which one would emerge victorious or what that might even mean for her. The snake, undeterred, reared up. It had never failed to kill this large before. Its body undulated, circling, searching for an opening. Then it lunged. The gorilla met the strike head-on. He ducked low and slammed his shoulder into the snake's body, grappling it mid-air. The two creatures crashed to the ground in a flurry of scales, fists, and snarling rage. Dust exploded around them. The earth trembled. Casey's cubs yelped and backed farther into the underbrush. Then, for a split second, all movement stopped. The gorilla had pinned the anaconda's head beneath a jagged rock, one massive hand pressing down with silent fury. The snake twisted and hissed, tail flailing wildly, but the gorilla held steady, his breath coming in hard bursts through clenched teeth. Casey stared, her mind spinning. She had seen those eyes before. Years ago, not long after she had left her birth pride, wounded and pregnant, she had wandered too close to the jungle's edge. Back then, she'd been too weak to hunt and too proud to return. She remembered a pair of eyes watching her from the trees, just like now, not with hunger, not with fear, but with something deeper, curiosity, recognition. The snake slipped loose, writhing violently, and the gorilla fell back. The two faced each other again. Blood now stained the grass, and the gorilla's arm hung lower, injured. Still, he stood tall, and Casey began to wonder, was this really the first time they'd met? The clearing had become a war zone. Scorched earth, crushed grass, blood streaking the mud. Yet the strangest thing wasn't the violence, it was the silence between blows. Neither the gorilla nor the anaconda made much sound. No growls, no cries, just the heavy breathing of two beings locked in a clash nature had never designed. Casey pulled herself upright with a grunt, one paw pressing into the dirt for support. Every breath was a knife in her ribs, but she couldn't let herself collapse. Her cubs were still out there, watching, afraid, and she had no idea if this battle would end with her rescue or her replacement on the anaconda's menu. The gorilla was slowing now. The injury on his arm had deepened, blood matting the thick hair along his forearm. But still, he stood his ground, eyes narrowed, every muscle in his body pulled tight. And then, out of nowhere, he made a sound. It wasn't a roar, it wasn't a warning. It was low, guttural, almost like a growl, but different, deeper, more human. It startled the anaconda. It even startled Casey, because it wasn't a sound meant to intimidate. It was something else entirely. Something familiar. Recognition. The gorilla took a step forward, and the snake, sensing something had shifted, began to back away. Not from fear, but calculation. It had failed. It was injured, and its instincts told it to survive another day. With a final twitch of its massive body, it slithered backward, disappearing into the underbrush from which it came. The grass rustled once, twice. Then nothing. The battle was over. The gorilla turned slowly to face Casey. His chest rose and fell with labored breaths. One eye was swollen, and a long scratch marred his side. But he didn't approach. He didn't even move. He just looked at her. Those same eyes, dark and calm, the ones she couldn't place and yet somehow knew. Casey stared back. The jungle was still again, but it wasn't peaceful. It was loaded with a kind of understanding, with a question she couldn't yet form, because something inside her said, this wasn't chance. This wasn't random, and deep down she knew. He didn't come for just any lioness. He came for her. The forest edge held its breath, as if it too were stunned by what had just occurred. The anaconda had vanished into the brush, defeated but not dead, and in its place stood a bleeding gorilla, battered, unmoving, his gaze still locked with Kessie's. The air between them crackled with something unspoken. Kessie forced herself to rise fully. Her ribs screamed with each movement, but she held her ground, head high, not out of pride, but out of confusion. The savannah and the jungle were two separate worlds. Their creatures didn't mix, didn't protect each other, didn't share stories or reasons or rescue missions, and yet this gorilla, this silent guardian, had defied all of it. He slowly sat, placing his injured arm over his lap as if to say, "I'm not here to threaten you." Kessie didn't relax, not yet, but she didn't retreat either. Behind her the cubs peeked out, eyes wide and wet. She let out a low rumble to reassure them, keeping one eye on the gorilla. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. He just watched. The way one watches the stars on a night when something feels different, with awe, with weight. Something about his stillness unsettled her more than the fight. This wasn't a creature acting on instinct. He had made a choice, a costly one. His arm was clearly broken and his fur matted with blood, and yet he stayed. Minutes passed. Kessie took a cautious step forward, testing not only her strength but his intentions. He didn't flinch. Instead, he did something that cracked her understanding of the world open just a little more. He bowed his head, not as prey, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, as if he knew her. And just as she opened her mouth, as if to growl or speak or something in between, her eyes caught something in the dirt nearby, a trail of prints, partially swept by the fight, leading from the trees. Not from the direction of the snake, from deeper in the jungle, and they weren't lion prints, they matched his. He hadn't stumbled upon the attack, he had been following her all along. Kessie stepped cautiously around the torn grass and upturned earth, her eyes never leaving the trail of footprints that led from the forest's heart to where the gorilla now sat, motionless. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the sharp scent of blood and damp earth, mingling with the tension that hung in the air like fog. The gorilla's breathing was slowing, his massive chest rising and falling in measured beats. Despite the clear pain etched in the way he sat, he showed no fear, no demand for thanks, no expectation, just quiet presence, an anchor in the middle of the chaos he had helped subdue. The cubs emerged at last from the brush. Lila rushed to Kessie's side, pressing into her injured leg. Tambo, always braver, crept closer to the stranger, his eyes wide with wonder, not fear. The gorilla turned his head slowly, meeting the cub's gaze with something impossibly gentle in his expression, a kind of recognition Kessie didn't understand. Not yet. Kessie let her paw brush the cub back, gently but firmly. The gorilla didn't move. Then finally the silence broke, not with sound, but with a memory. Years ago, before Kessie had become a mother, before she had even joined her current pride, she had wandered deep into the jungle during a season of desperate hunger. Alone, limping from an old wound, she had collapsed near a waterfall deep in gorilla territory. She had expected death. What she found instead was strange. A group of gorillas had spotted her. Most kept their distance, but one, younger, curious, unusually fearless, had lingered near. He had watched her from the trees, and when the others left, he returned. Quietly, over several days, he had left her strange offerings: fruit, bark, once even a rabbit, dead but whole. Kessie had eaten. She had healed. She had left. She had never looked back until now. She stared at the gorilla, the shape of his face, the depth of his eyes. Older now, stronger, but the same gaze, the same silence. And suddenly, it all made sense. This wasn't a stranger. This was a debt, one she had forgotten, one he never had. The light had begun to fade, and the golden hour bathed the clearing in amber. Shadows stretched long across the savannah as the jungle seemed to settle around them. But Kessie's heart beat faster now, not from fear, but from the weight of realization. The gorilla shifted slightly, favoring his injured side, but his eyes stayed on her. Not pleading, not proud, just patient, as if he'd waited years for this moment, not of recognition, but of return. She stepped forward slowly, her breath shallow. The pain in her ribs was now a dull throb. Tambo and Lila stayed behind her, sensing the shift. She stopped just a few feet from the gorilla. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then she lowered her head, not in submission, but in something rare among predators, gratitude, because she remembered. That time, in the jungle, had been a blur of hunger and shame. She'd been so weak, too weak to hunt, too proud to call for her pride. The strange offerings had saved her, a survival she'd chalked up to luck, or maybe the land itself. But it hadn't been the land. It had been him. And now, years later, when she had something to lose, when her cubs watched her bleed and die, he had returned that act without hesitation. She looked down again at the footprints. The path he'd taken to find her, the deliberate trail leading straight to the waterhole, as if he had known where she would be. Had he been watching her all this time, or had something deeper pulled him there? Some ancient recognition, something stronger than instinct. Whatever it wasn't random. And as her cubs pressed close to her side, she felt something shift inside her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Trust, not the kind born of bloodlines or territory, but of choice, of memory. The gorilla began to rise slowly, wincing, towering again. He glanced once more at the cubs, then at Kessie, and with a final silent nod, he turned and walked back into the trees. He didn't look back. He didn't need to, because this story, etched in the dirt and blood of the wild, wasn't over. It was a vow, renewed in silence. Dusk settled gently over the clearing, casting a muted glow on the bloodied earth and crushed reeds. The chaos had passed, but its echo still lingered in the tremble of leaves and the uneven rhythm of Kessie's breath. She stood still for a long time, watching the jungle swallow the figure of the gorilla until only shadows remained. Beside her, Tambo nuzzled her flank, while Lila kept a wary eye on the tree line. Neither spoke, not in roars, not in growls, not in the tiny mewls that cubs usually made when frightened. It was as if they, too, understood that something far larger than a fight had just taken place. Not a battle for survival, a reminder of connection. In the savannah, where life is measured, in dominance and instinct, stories like this are rarely told, and almost never believed. But Kessie knew what she had seen, felt what had shifted. The gorilla hadn't saved her because of power, or territory, or gain. He had done it because once, years ago, she had mattered to him, and now, through the silent language of the wild, he had returned that meaning. As the last light dipped below the horizon, Kessie turned toward her cubs. She nuzzled them close, guiding them gently away from the blood-soaked soil and back toward the tall grass. Her steps were slow, deliberate. She would heal. Her body would carry the scars, but her heart, something there had softened, reopened before. Disappearing into the distance, she glanced back one last time. The clearing was empty, but she knew it wasn't forgotten. Somewhere in the jungle, a silent protector moved through the trees, no longer bound by instinct alone, but by a memory, a moment, and a bond that neither species nor time could erase. And from that day on, whenever the wind rustled through the reeds or the cubs stared curiously at the trees, Kessie would tell them, not in words, but in looks and stories shaped by survival. That sometimes the wild is wiser than we understand, and that loyalty can grow where no one thinks to look. Thank you for being here with us. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share your thoughts in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? Which part of Kessie's journey spoke to your heart the most? We'd love to hear from you, your stories, your insights, and the wild instincts that shape us all.